So abandons his brother for wealth. Years later, his success stuns the world. The city lights flickered in the distance, stretching endlessly beyond the broken window of their tiny apartment. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of old books and the faint remnants of instant noodles. Daniel sat at the small wooden desk, the only real piece of furniture in the room, hunched over an old, battered laptop. The screen glowed dimly, illuminating the sharp angles of his face as he furiously typed, lost in his own world of numbers and financial projections. Across from him, his younger brother Samuel lay on their shared mattress, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling, lost in thought. They had lived like this for as long as they could remember, just the two of them, scraping by, surviving. Their parents had passed when they were teenagers, leaving them with nothing but a lifetime of struggle and a promise to each other that they would always stick together. "You should get some sleep," Samuel murmured, his voice thick with exhaustion. Daniel didn't look up. "I can't. I have to finish this application." Samuel rolled onto his side, propping himself up on one elbow. "Another business scholarship? This one's different," Daniel said, the excitement barely concealed beneath his usual composed tone. "If I get this, it's full tuition. Plus, housing, meals, everything. It's in New York, Sam. This is my shot." Samuel sat up fully now, the weight of those words pressing down on him. "New York?" His voice was quieter now, hesitant. "That's far." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his short, dark hair. "I know. But this is what we always talked about, right? Getting out of here, making something of ourselves?" Samuel's expression tightened. "We talked about doing it together." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken fears. Samuel had always been the anchor between them, the one who kept their heads above water when things got bad. He worked odd jobs, picked up shifts at the auto shop, made sure they always had enough to eat. Daniel, on the other hand, had his eyes on something bigger, always chasing opportunities, always reaching for a future beyond their tiny, suffocating apartment. "This is my best chance, Sam," Daniel said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "I have to take it?" Samuel swallowed hard. "And what happens to me?" Daniel hesitated. "I'll send money. I'll make sure you're okay." A humorless laugh escaped Samuel's lips. "Money? That's what this is about, huh? You think throwing a few dollars my way makes up for leaving?" "It's not like that," Daniel said, frustration creeping into his voice. "This is about survival. We've spent our whole lives struggling. I can't do this forever. I can't live paycheck to paycheck, wondering if we'll have rent money next month." Samuel's jaw tightened. "And I can." Daniel looked away. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The distant hum of the city outside filled the room, punctuated by the occasional siren wailing in the night. Samuel ran a hand over his face, exhaling heavily. "If you go," he finally said, "just promise me one thing." Daniel looked at him, waiting. "Don't forget where you came from." A lump formed in Daniel's throat, but he nodded. "I won't." Samuel gave a small, tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good. Because if you do, then all of this, everything we've been through, it means nothing." Daniel wanted to say something, to promise that he would always be there, that their bond would never break. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Once he stepped onto that plane, once he entered the world he had been chasing, things would change. They always did. The day Daniel left, the sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain. They stood outside their apartment complex, the cracked pavement beneath their feet reflecting the weight of the moment. Daniel's duffel bag was slung over his shoulder, filled with everything he owned. Samuel stood beside him, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "You gonna say goodbye?" Samuel asked. Daniel forced a smile. "It's not goodbye. Just see you later." Samuel scoffed. "Right?" Daniel hesitated before reaching into his pocket, pulling out a small wad of cash. "For rent. And food." Samuel looked at the money, then back at Daniel. He didn't take it. "I don't want your money, Danny." Daniel sighed, pushing the cash into Samuel's jacket pocket. "Take it. Just in case." Samuel didn't argue, but the look on his face said everything. This wasn't about money. It was about something much bigger, something that Daniel was too afraid to put into words. The bus pulled up, its brakes hissing against the wet pavement. Daniel glanced at Samuel one last time. "Take care of yourself, okay?" Samuel nodded, but he didn't say anything. Daniel turned and climbed onto the bus, taking a seat by the window. As the vehicle rumbled to life and pulled away, he watched his brother grow smaller and smaller in the distance, until he was nothing more than a figure standing alone in the rain. He told himself he would call. He told himself he would write. He told himself that no matter how far he went, he would never forget where he came from. But as the city skyline faded behind him and the road stretched out toward a new future, he wondered if promises made in the past could ever truly survive the weight of ambition. The plane ride to New York was uneventful, but Daniel couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his chest. He told himself it was nerves, excitement even, but deep down he knew the truth. It was guilt. By the time he arrived at the dorms, his phone had already buzzed twice. Messages from Samuel. "Made it safe? Let me know when you settle in." Daniel stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He could reply. It would take 2 seconds. Instead, he tossed his phone onto the bed and let the exhaustion take over. The weeks that followed were a blur. Classes, networking events, sleepless nights poring over case studies. Every student here was hungry, but Daniel? He was starving. He had spent his entire life clawing his way up from nothing. This was his chance to finally be someone. Samuel called once, then twice. Then he stopped. Daniel told himself it was for the best. He didn't have time for distractions. He was surrounded by people who had spent their lives preparing for this moment, who had parents in boardrooms and trust funds waiting for them. He had nothing but raw ambition. That had to be enough. And for a while it was. His professors took notice of his relentless drive. He secured an internship at a prestigious investment firm by the end of his first semester, a feat almost unheard of. Everything was falling into place. Except for one thing. Samuel. One night, after a long day at the firm, Daniel found himself scrolling through his messages. There was a single unread one from months ago. "Not sure if you're busy or just don't care anymore, but I hope you're okay." Daniel stared at the words, a pit forming in his stomach. He wanted to respond. He wanted to tell Samuel that he cared, that he thought about him all the time, that he wasn't forgetting where he came from. But what would he say? "Sorry for abandoning you? I promise I'll make it up to you?" He locked his phone and shoved it into his pocket. Years passed. Daniel rose through the ranks with an efficiency that terrified even his superiors. He worked harder, stayed later, never let anything, not friendships, not relationships, not even his past, distract him. By 25, he was already making 6 figures. By 28, he was running entire divisions. By 30, he was one of the youngest executives in the company's history. Success had come at a cost, but Daniel told himself it was worth it. Then one evening, while reviewing financial reports in his penthouse, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him pick up. "Daniel Wright?" The voice on the other end was cautious. "I'm calling from St. Mercy's Hospital in Chicago. Are you related to a Samuel Wright?" Daniel felt the breath leave his lungs. His grip tightened around the phone. "Why, he's my brother." "Why?" There was a pause. Then, the words that would haunt him forever. "He was admitted last night. Severe pneumonia. He's stable, but he's been listed as having no emergency contact. Your number was the only one in his records." Daniel was already standing, already reaching for his coat. "I'm coming." For the first time in years, he booked a flight back home. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and something stale, something Daniel couldn't quite place but made his stomach turn. He hadn't been back to Chicago in nearly a decade, and now, standing in the hallway of a rundown hospital, he felt like an outsider. A nurse led him to Samuel's room, her eyes scanning him with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. He knew what she saw, a man in an expensive suit, with a watch that cost more than her monthly salary, standing in a hospital where the walls were peeling and the air was thick with quiet suffering. Samuel was asleep when Daniel walked in. He looked different, older, somehow, more tired. His once strong frame had thinned out, his skin pale against the stark white sheets. There were dark circles under his eyes, and the sight of them made something inside Daniel twist painfully. A machine beeped steadily beside him, a quiet, rhythmic reminder that time was still moving, that Samuel was still here. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. "God, Sam," he murmured. "What happened to you?" The guilt hit him like a freight train. He had spent years building his empire, convincing himself that his sacrifices were justified. That Samuel would be fine without him. But looking at him now, hooked up to machines, barely holding on, Daniel realized how wrong he had been. Samuel stirred, his eyelids fluttering before he slowly opened his eyes. For a moment he just stared, blinking as if unsure whether what he was seeing was real. Then his lips parted slightly. His voice was weak, hoarse. "Danny?" Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah, it's me." Samuel's eyes flickered with something unreadable before he let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Wow. Never thought I'd see you again." Daniel sat down beside the bed, ignoring the sting of those words. "I should have come sooner." Samuel let out a breath, shifting slightly. "Yeah, you should have." Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Then, Samuel shook his head. "What are you even doing here?" "The hospital called me," Daniel admitted. "Said I was your emergency contact." Samuel's lips quirked up slightly, but there was no humor in it. "Didn't think you'd still have the same number?" Daniel hesitated. "Neither did I." Another beat of silence. "You should get some rest," Daniel said softly. Samuel studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Yeah, guess I should." As his eyes drifted shut, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had spent years convincing himself that he didn't need Samuel. But now, watching his brother, his only real family, lying in a hospital bed, Daniel realized the truth. He had never stopped needing him. He had just been too proud to admit it. The next morning, Daniel met with the doctor, his fingers tapping restlessly against the side of his coffee cup. He listened intently as the doctor explained Samuel's condition. "His immune system is weak," the doctor said. "He hasn't been taking care of himself properly. Poor diet, lack of rest, stress, I imagine. If he had waited any longer to come in, it could have been much worse." Daniel frowned. Why didn't he go to a doctor sooner? The doctor hesitated. "I don't think he could afford it." Daniel felt his chest tighten. "You mean to tell me," he said slowly, "that my brother almost died because he didn't have enough money?" The doctor nodded solemnly. Daniel clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists. All these years he had been throwing away money on lavish parties, designer suits, vacations that he barely enjoyed. And meanwhile, Samuel had been suffering. He had failed him, and he was going to fix it. That night, Daniel sat by Samuel's bed, watching as his brother slept. He had already settled the medical bills, ensured that Samuel would get the best care possible. But money wouldn't fix this. Money wouldn't undo the years of silence, the distance, the abandonment. As he stared at his brother's sleeping form, he made a silent vow. He would make things right, even if it took the rest of his life. Samuel stirred awake in the dim light of the hospital room. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the faint hum of distant footsteps in the hall reminded him of where he was before he even opened his eyes. And then he saw him. Daniel sat in the chair beside his bed, elbows resting on his knees, fingers pressed together in a pensive pose. His sharp navy suit looked out of place against the sterile white walls, but it wasn't the suit that unsettled Samuel. It was the way Daniel looked at him, like he was trying to figure out what to say, like he wanted to fix something he couldn't even name. Samuel shifted slightly, wincing at the dull ache in his body. "You're still here." Daniel straightened, his expression unreadable. "Where else would I be?" Samuel gave a weak, dry chuckle. "I don't know. Back in New York? Running your empire? That's what you do, right? Move forward, never look back?" Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands together. "Sam? Save it?" Samuel's voice was hoarse, but his tone was firm. "I don't need the 'I'm sorry' speech. It's been too many years for that." Daniel looked down at the floor, swallowing hard. He knew he deserved that. "You didn't even answer my messages," Samuel continued, his voice quieter now, almost tired. "Not once." Daniel flinched. You left and you never looked back, Samuel cut in, shaking his head. I used to tell myself you were busy, that you were grinding, trying to make something of yourself. But after a while, I stopped lying to myself. Daniel felt the guilt in his chest tighten, pressing against his ribs like a vice. I wasn't trying to abandon you. Samuel scoffed. That's exactly what you did. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Daniel leaned forward, his voice almost desperate now. I thought if I made it, if I built something, it would mean something. That all the sacrifices would be worth it. And was it? Samuel asked, staring at him. Daniel hesitated. Was it? He had the money, the power, the prestige. But as he sat there, in this dimly lit hospital room, watching the only person who had ever truly been family to him lie weak and exhausted in a hospital bed, he felt like he had nothing at all. No, Daniel admitted finally. Not like I thought it would. Samuel studied him for a moment, then turned his gaze to the ceiling. You know, I never cared about the money, Danny. I never needed you to be a millionaire. I just needed my brother. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, the words cutting deep. I want to make things right, he said after a moment. Samuel huffed a laugh. You can't just throw money at this and fix it. I know, Daniel said quickly. That's not what I'm trying to do. Samuel turned his head slightly, looking at him again. His expression was guarded, but there was something behind it, something that Daniel hoped wasn't completely lost. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, Daniel continued. I don't even know if I deserve that. But I can't go back and change what I did. All I can do is try now. If you let me. Samuel sighed, running a hand over his face. He looked exhausted. I don't know, Danny. I really don't. Daniel nodded slowly. It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it wasn't a no. For now, that was enough. The next few days passed in quiet rhythms. Daniel stayed at the hospital, ensuring Samuel had everything he needed. He sat by his bedside, sometimes in silence, sometimes exchanging short conversations that never quite reached the depth either of them wanted. He ordered the best nutritionists to come in, spoke to the doctors about extended care, even made arrangements for a private specialist. Samuel protested at first, but he was too weak to fight much, and deep down, Daniel suspected he didn't really want to. Still, Daniel knew that money wouldn't fix what was truly broken. It wasn't until the fourth day that Samuel finally said it. You can stop babysitting me, you know, he muttered, stirring his tea with a tiny plastic spoon. I'm not dying. Daniel smirked slightly, leaning back in his chair. No, but you scared the hell out of me. Samuel rolled his eyes. I'll be fine. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. What happened, Sam? How did things get so bad? Samuel's grip on the spoon tightened. Things didn't get bad, Danny. They just never got better. Daniel frowned. But why didn't you reach out? You should have told me. Samuel let out a bitter laugh. Reach out? To? The brother who ignored every message, every call? The brother who made it painfully clear that he didn't have time for me? Daniel felt like he had been slapped. That's not fair. Isn't it? Samuel shot back, eyes burning. Tell me, Daniel. When was the last time you thought about me before that hospital call? Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Because Samuel was right. Samuel scoffed, shaking his head. Exactly. Daniel swallowed hard, the weight of his guilt heavier than ever. I don't know what to say. Samuel leaned back, exhaling. I don't either. A beat of silence. Then, finally, softer this time, Samuel added, but you're here now. Daniel nodded. Yeah, I am. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. 2 weeks later, Samuel was discharged. Daniel insisted he come stay with him. He had a penthouse in the city, more than enough space. But Samuel refused. I have my own life, Danny, he said. I'm not just some project for you to fix. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not trying to fix you. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I don't want to lose you again. Samuel studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. Then don't. Daniel swallowed, nodding back. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a promise. But it was hope. Over the next few months, Daniel made a real effort. He called. He visited. He made sure that, for the first time in years, Samuel didn't feel like an afterthought. Samuel, for his part, was cautious. He let Daniel back in, slowly, but the wounds ran deep. He had spent years learning how to live without his brother, learning how to stop needing him. But there were moments, small ones, quiet ones, where things felt almost normal again. One evening, they sat together at a diner, plates of greasy burgers in front of them. It was the first time in years that Daniel had eaten something that wasn't prepared by a Michelin star chef. "You still drown your fries in ketchup, huh?" Daniel teased, watching as Samuel practically submerged his food in red. Samuel smirked. "You still eat like you're at a five-star restaurant, huh?" Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess some things never change." Samuel's smile faltered slightly, but he didn't look away. "Yeah," he said softly. "Guess not." Daniel felt the lump in his throat again, the weight of the years between them. He wanted to say something. He wanted to tell Samuel that he missed him, that he regretted everything. Instead, he picked up a fry, dipped it in a ridiculous amount of ketchup, and shoved it into his mouth. Samuel snorted, shaking his head. "Idiot." Daniel grinned. "You're idiot, brother." Samuel hesitated for half a second. Then quietly he nodded. "Yeah." And for the first time in years, Daniel felt something warm settle in his chest. Daniel adjusted his tie as he stepped out of his luxury car, standing in front of the small auto repair shop that Samuel now worked at. The place was old but well kept, with faded blue paint and a crooked open sign hanging on the door. It was nothing like the high-rise office buildings Daniel was used to, but for some reason, it felt heavier, more real. He exhaled, pushing the door open. A small bell chimed as he entered. The smell of grease and gasoline filled the air, mixed with a faint scent of coffee brewing somewhere in the back. The shop was busy. Mechanics moved around, calling out orders, the sound of tools clanking against metal echoing through the space. And then there he was. Samuel stood at one of the workstations, sleeves rolled up, grease smudging his forearms as he wiped his hands on a rag. His hair was a little messy, his posture relaxed but focused. He hadn't noticed Daniel yet. Daniel took a deep breath, suddenly feeling out of place in his tailored suit, standing in a world that wasn't his. But he was here, and he wasn't leaving. One of the other mechanics spotted him first. "Hey, Sam," the guy called out. "Some corporate guy is here for you. You in trouble or something?" Samuel looked up, and for a brief moment, his expression was unreadable. Then, with a sigh, he tossed the rag onto the workbench and walked over. "What are you doing here, Danny?" Samuel asked, crossing his arms. Daniel hesitated. "Just wanted to see you." Samuel arched an eyebrow. "At my job?" Daniel gave a small shrug. "You never call first before showing up at my place." Samuel huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Touché." There was a pause, filled with the hum of machinery and distant voices. Then Samuel gestured toward the back. "Come on. Let's talk outside." The alley behind the shop was quiet, save for the occasional sound of cars passing by on the main road. Samuel leaned against the brick wall, pulling a cigarette from his pocket and lighting it. Daniel frowned. "Since when do you smoke?" Samuel took a slow drag, exhaling into the crisp evening air. "Since I stopped having anyone to tell me not to." Daniel looked down, guilt creeping in again. "Right?" Samuel studied him for a moment. "So, really, why are you here?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "I wanted to see where you worked." "You hate places like this," Samuel said, smirking. "I remember you complaining about getting your hands dirty even when we had to fix Mom's old car." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "That was different. That car was a piece of junk." Samuel grinned. "Yeah, but it was ours." Daniel's smile faded slightly. "I should have been there, Sam." Samuel exhaled another cloud of smoke, his gaze distant. "Yeah, you should have." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything left unsaid. Daniel took a step forward. "I can help you, you know." Samuel stiffened slightly. "With what?" "Money. A better job. A place in the city," Daniel said carefully. "You don't have to keep doing this if you don't want to." Samuel let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "There it is." Daniel frowned. "What?" "The fix-it offer," Samuel said, his voice carrying something close to disappointment. "You think throwing money at this will make it better?" "It's not like that." "It is," Samuel interrupted, pushing off the wall. "You don't know how to fix this, so you do what you've always done, write a check and hope it makes up for everything." Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but he couldn't, because Samuel was right. Samuel sighed, rubbing his temples. "Danny, I don't need your money. I don't need a fancy job. I don't even need an apology." "Then what do you need?" Daniel asked, his voice quiet. Samuel met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "But I don't know if you even know how to be my brother anymore." Daniel felt those words like a punch to the gut. Samuel put out his cigarette, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Look, I appreciate you showing up. I do. But you can't just waltz back in and expect everything to be fine." "I know," Daniel admitted. "But I'm not giving up." Samuel exhaled, looking at him for a long moment. Then, with a small nod, he turned to go back inside. "See you around, Danny." Daniel stood there, watching him walk away, the weight of his own choices pressing down on him like never before. The following week, Daniel found himself parked outside the shop again. This time, he didn't go in. Instead, he sat in his car, watching through the windshield as Samuel moved through the garage, laughing with his co-workers, completely at ease in his world. A world that Daniel had left behind. For years, he had convinced himself that success meant escaping, that he had to cut ties with his old life to move forward. But now, looking at Samuel, his brother, the only family he had, he realized that maybe he had been running from the wrong things. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Investor meeting, 30 minutes. Daniel sighed. He should go. He had a multi-million-dollar deal waiting for him. But instead, he turned off his phone and stepped out of the car. Samuel noticed him this time, wiping his hands on a rag as Daniel approached. "You back again?" Samuel asked, amused. Daniel nodded. "Yeah. Thought maybe we could grab a beer after your shift." Samuel studied him for a moment, then gave a small smirk. "Depends. You still drink that overpriced imported crap?" Daniel chuckled. "Guess you'll have to find out." Samuel rolled his eyes but didn't say no. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something unfamiliar. Like maybe, just maybe, they could still find their way back to each other. Weeks passed. The visits became more frequent. The conversations longer. At first, Samuel was hesitant, always keeping a part of himself guarded, as if waiting for Daniel to disappear again. But slowly, something shifted. One evening, after a few too many beers at the local dive bar, Samuel leaned back in his chair, watching Daniel with a thoughtful expression. "You're different," he muttered. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Yeah." Samuel nodded. "I mean, you still look like a corporate sellout." Daniel laughed. "Thanks. But you're trying," Samuel admitted, swirling his drink. "I see that." Daniel hesitated before speaking. "I don't want to lose you again, Sam." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then finally he sighed. "Then don't." It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It wasn't an instant fix. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Daniel kept showing up, not just at the repair shop, but in Samuel's life. He was careful about it, though. He didn't push too hard, didn't try to force things. Instead, he did something he hadn't done in years. He listened. He listened to Samuel talk about the customers who came in with impossible repair jobs. He listened as Samuel complained about the rising cost of rent, about the endless cycle of working just to stay afloat. He listened to stories about people Daniel would never have met, people who had become Samuel's makeshift family when Daniel had disappeared. And little by little, the walls between them started to come down. One evening, after closing up the shop, they found themselves at a quiet bar, the kind of place where no one wore suits and the beer was served in frosted mugs instead of fancy glassware. Samuel leaned back against the booth, watching his brother nurse his drink. "So, tell me something," he said, tapping his fingers on the wooden table. "You're some big shot CEO, right? What's it like being rich?" Daniel smirked, taking a sip of his beer. "Overrated." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Seriously?" Daniel sighed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. It's complicated. At first, it was everything I wanted. The money, the power, the recognition. But the higher you climb, the lonelier it gets. Samuel studied him for a moment. That why you're really here? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. Samuel exhaled, rubbing his chin. I figured. They sat in silence for a moment before Samuel spoke again. You ever think about walking away from it? Daniel let out a breath. More than I'd like to admit. Samuel frowned. Then why don't you? Daniel looked down at his drink. Because it's all I know now. Samuel shook his head, but there was no judgment in his eyes. You always were stubborn as hell. Daniel chuckled. Yeah, guess I was. Another pause. Then Samuel smirked. Still are. Daniel laughed, and for the first time in years, it felt real. A month later, Daniel found himself staring at his phone, debating whether to make the call. He had been avoiding it for weeks, but he knew he couldn't put it off any longer. Finally, he pressed the button. Daniel. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional. Lucas, Daniel said. I need to talk to you about something. Lucas Sterling was his business partner, the man who had helped him build everything. He was ruthless, sharp, and completely focused on one thing, profit. Make it quick, Lucas said. We have a meeting in 20. Daniel exhaled. I want out. Silence. Then a quiet chuckle. Funny. Now what do you really want? I'm serious, Lucas, Daniel said. I don't want to do this anymore. Lucas was silent for a moment. Then, his voice dropped to something colder. You don't just walk away from a company like this, Daniel. Daniel clenched his jaw. Watch me. You're making a mistake, Lucas warned. You built this empire. You're really going to throw it all away. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. I'd rather lose the company than lose my brother again. Lucas scoffed. Family makes you weak. I told you that years ago. Then I guess I'm weak, Daniel said. I'll have the lawyers handle the transition. Before Lucas could say anything else, Daniel hung up. He sat there for a moment, the weight of his decisions settling over him. And then, for the first time in years, he felt free. Samuel stared at him like he had grown two heads. You what? I stepped down, Daniel said simply, taking a sip of his coffee. They were sitting in Samuel's apartment, a small but comfortable space with mismatched furniture and a window that overlooked the city skyline. Samuel blinked. You just walked away? Daniel nodded. Yeah. Jesus, Samuel muttered, rubbing his temples. I didn't think you'd actually do it. Daniel smirked. Neither did Lucas. Samuel shook his head. So what now? You just gonna retire and live off your millions? Daniel leaned back, considering the question. I don't know. I haven't figured that part out yet. Samuel studied him for a moment before sighing. You really are an idiot? Daniel chuckled. Probably. Samuel rolled his eyes. But maybe a slightly less terrible one than before. Daniel grinned. I'll take it. For the first time in years, Daniel had no meetings to rush to, no endless calls, no emails demanding his attention. It was unsettling, but it was also freeing. He spent more time with Samuel, learning about the life he had missed. He met his coworkers, the people who had become his family in Daniel's absence. And slowly, he started to understand something. Success wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It was about people. And the people he cared about the most? They had been right in front of him all along. One afternoon, as they sat on the fire escape outside Samuel's apartment, Daniel turned to his brother. I have an idea, he said. Samuel raised an eyebrow. That sounds dangerous. Daniel smirked. Hear me out. He took a breath. What if we started something together? Samuel frowned. Started what? A business, Daniel said. Something small. Something that actually helps people? Samuel snorted. You? Running a small business? You sure your ego can handle that? Daniel chuckled. I think I'll survive. Samuel studied him for a moment. You're serious? Daniel nodded. Yeah, I am. Samuel hesitated, then sighed. All right, hotshot. Tell me your plan. Daniel grinned. Gladly. 6 months later, They stood in front of the newly opened Wright and Company, a community-based investment firm designed to help small businesses grow without the predatory practices of traditional banks. It wasn't about making millions. It was about making a difference. And for the first time in his life, Daniel finally felt like he was doing something that mattered. As they walked through the doors together, Samuel clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Welcome to the real world, Danny." Daniel smiled. It was good to be home. Daniel had expected challenges. After all, starting a business was never easy, but nothing had prepared him for just how different this world was from the one he had ruled before. In his corporate life, he had armies of employees, endless resources, and high-powered connections to push through any problem. He had a tiny office, a handful of local clients, and a stubborn younger brother who questioned every decision he made. "You're thinking too big again," Samuel told him one afternoon as they sat across from each other, reviewing their first quarter financials. Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Samuel tapped the spreadsheet with his pen. "This whole model assumes we'll have a massive influx of capital within the first year. That's not how small businesses work, Danny. We need to take it slow." Daniel leaned back, rubbing his temples. "I've never done slow before." Samuel smirked. "Yeah, I know. That's how you ended up in a glass tower with no one to talk to?" Daniel rolled his eyes, but he didn't argue. Because, as much as he hated to admit it, Samuel was right. Starting over was humbling. There were no extravagant corporate parties, no private jets, no million-dollar deals being signed in luxury conference rooms. Instead, there were late nights at the office, cheap takeout containers piling up on their desks, and moments of doubt when they questioned whether they had made the right decision at all. But there were also victories, small but meaningful. A struggling bakery that they helped secure a loan, allowing it to keep its doors open. A single mother who wanted to start a home-based business but didn't know where to begin. A retired mechanic who had been scammed out of his savings but was given a second chance through their firm. These weren't the kinds of deals that made headlines, but they were the kind that mattered. One evening, as they locked up the office, Daniel turned to Samuel. "You ever think about what would have happened if I had never left?" Samuel glanced at him, considering the question. "Yeah," he admitted. "All the time." Daniel hesitated. "And?" Samuel sighed, leaning against the door. "I think we would have struggled. I think we would have fought. But I think maybe we would have figured it out together." Daniel swallowed hard. "I hate that I wasn't there for you." Samuel exhaled, looking up at the darkening sky. "Yeah, me too." A beat of silence passed between them. "But," Samuel said finally, pushing off the door, "you're here now." Daniel met his gaze. "Yeah, I am." Samuel smirked. "And you're stuck with me now, so no running off to another city this time." Daniel chuckled. "Wouldn't dream of it." They walked down the sidewalk together, the neon glow of streetlights casting long shadows behind them. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The months turned into a year. Wright and Company grew, not into a corporate empire, but into something steady, something reliable. Their client list expanded, their reputation in the community solidified. They weren't the biggest firm, but they were the one people trusted. And for Daniel, that was enough. He had traded billion-dollar mergers for one-on-one consultations with local shop owners. He had swapped high-rise luxury for a small, cozy office where the coffee was terrible but the company was good. And most importantly, he had his brother back. One afternoon, as they sat in the office going over paperwork, Samuel looked up suddenly. "You know," he said, "I never asked. Why did you really leave the company?" Daniel sighed, setting his pen down. "I told you. I didn't want to lose you again." Samuel studied him. "Yeah, but that's not the whole reason, is it?" Daniel hesitated. Then, finally, he exhaled. I think I realized that I didn't like the person I had become." Samuel frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "I spent years chasing money, power, recognition. And I got all of it. But at some point I stopped recognizing myself." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "And now?" Daniel gave a small smile. "Now, I think I'm finally figuring out who I am again." Samuel smirked. "Took you long enough?" Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, guess it did." One evening, after closing the office, they found themselves sitting on the hood of Samuel's old car, parked on a quiet street. The air was cool, the city lights blinking in the distance. "You ever regret it?" Samuel asked, staring at the sky. "Regret what?" "Walking away from all that money. The power. The success." Daniel thought about it for a moment. Then he shook his head. "No, not anymore." Samuel glanced at him. "Not even a little?" Daniel smirked. "Well, maybe I missed the private jet." Samuel laughed. "Yeah, I bet you do, you spoiled bastard." Daniel grinned, but then his expression turned serious. "I don't regret choosing this, Sam." "Choosing us?" Samuel nodded slowly. "Good. Because neither do I." They sat there for a long time, just two brothers who had lost each other once but had found their way back. The city stretched out before them, full of possibilities. And for the first time in years, they faced it together. The new office was bigger, not by much, but enough to accommodate their growing team. Wright and Company had become something neither of them had expected. They had expanded beyond small businesses, creating programs to help young entrepreneurs, working-class families, and even people trying to rebuild their lives after financial hardships. It wasn't about money. It was about people. And at the heart of it all, there were two brothers who had built something from the ground up, not just a business, but a life worth living. Daniel leaned against the office doorway, watching Samuel joke with a new employee. He couldn't help but smile. "Something funny?" Samuel asked, raising an eyebrow. Daniel shook his head. "Just thinking." "Oh," Samuel said. "That's dangerous." Daniel laughed. "No. I'm glad we did this." Samuel smirked. "Yeah, me too." And with that, they went back to work, together. Because in the end, that was all that really mattered. Daniel had once thought that success was about money, power, and prestige. But now he knew the truth. Success wasn't about how much you had. It was about who you had beside you when it mattered most. And Daniel? He finally had his brother back. And that was worth more than all the wealth in the world. Flashback, 15 years ago. The summer heat in Chicago was unforgiving, pressing against the cracked sidewalks and the rusted fire escapes of their rundown apartment building. Daniel, 14 years old and already taller than most of the kids in their neighborhood, sat cross-legged on the rooftop, an old notebook resting on his lap. Beside him, Samuel, just 11, with a head full of wild curls and scraped-up knees, stared out over the city, his legs swinging idly over the edge of the rooftop. "You really think we'll get out of here one day?" Samuel asked, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. Daniel didn't look up from his notebook. "I don't think, Sam." "I know." Samuel frowned, pulling at a loose thread on his shorts. "Mom and Dad thought that too. And look where we are." Daniel's grip on his pen tightened slightly. He didn't like talking about their parents. Not because he didn't miss them, he did. But because thinking about them meant acknowledging the truth, that no one was coming to save them. "We're not them," Daniel said after a moment. "We're gonna make it?" Samuel sighed, lying back against the rooftop, staring up at the sky. "How?" Daniel hesitated, glancing at his younger brother. "You ever hear about the 80-20 rule?" Samuel rolled his eyes. "Is this another one of your nerd talks?" Daniel smirked. "Just listen. The 80-20 rule says that 80% of results come from 20% of the effort. It means most people waste time doing things that don't actually help them." Samuel groaned. "Genius. And how does that help us?" Daniel turned to face him, eyes alight with determination. "Because it means if we focus on the right things, we don't have to stay stuck here. We just have to work smarter, not harder." Samuel wrinkled his nose. "You sound like one of those guys on TV who sell fake business books." Daniel laughed, shoving him lightly. "Shut up, I'm serious." Samuel grinned, but then his expression softened. "So what's your 20%? Daniel hesitated, glancing down at his notebook, then back at his brother. "I'm gonna learn everything I can about business. Stocks, investments, deals. I'm gonna figure out how people get rich and do it better." Samuel sat up, tilting his head. "And me?" Daniel hesitated. "You'll be with me." Samuel's lips twitched into a small, lopsided smile. "You promise?" Daniel didn't hesitate this time. I promise. Flashback, 10 years ago. Their apartment had always been small, but after their parents died, it started to feel even smaller. The air was heavy with the kind of silence that only came from grief. Daniel was 18 now, standing in front of their broken refrigerator, staring at a single carton of milk and half a loaf of bread. Samuel, 15, sat at the kitchen table, flipping through his homework. He was pretending not to notice the emptiness of their fridge, but Daniel knew better. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. You hungry? Samuel shrugged. I'm good. Daniel sighed, reaching into his wallet. A crumpled $20 bill stared back at him. He knew he should save it. But Samuel was hungry. Come on, Daniel said, grabbing his jacket. Let's get something to eat. Samuel looked up, hesitant. We shouldn't waste money. Daniel forced a grin. Let's call it an investment. You can't ace your math test on an empty stomach. Samuel smirked. Pretty sure that's not how investments work. Daniel ruffled his hair. Smartest. Let's go. They ended up at a cheap diner, the kind where the seats were cracked, and the jukebox in the corner only played songs from 20 years ago. Samuel dug into his burger like it was the best meal he'd ever had. Daniel, however, barely touched his food. He was thinking. Planning. Hey, Sam, he said suddenly. Samuel looked up, chewing. What? You ever think about what you want to do? Samuel swallowed, wiping his hands on a napkin. What do you mean? Daniel leaned forward. Like, for the future. What do you want to be? Samuel hesitated. I don't know. I always figured, whatever you do, I'll just do too. Daniel's heart clenched at that. Because it was the truth. Samuel had always followed him, always trusted that Daniel knew best. And maybe back then, Daniel had believed that too. But life had other plans. Flashback 7 years ago, the night everything changed. The letter sat on the kitchen table, crisp and official, the school's name printed at the top in bold letters. Samuel stared at it like it was a bomb waiting to go off. You're leaving, he said quietly. Daniel exhaled. It's not like that. Samuel scoffed, pushing away from the table. Like hell it isn't. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping into his voice. Sam, this is my shot. This is what we've been working for, what we talked about for years. Samuel shook his head. No, Daniel. This is what you talked about. Daniel stiffened. That's not fair. Samuel's jaw clenched. You promised me. Daniel's stomach twisted. I know. You said we'd figure it out together, Samuel pressed. That we wouldn't leave each other behind. Daniel swallowed hard. I don't have a choice. Samuel let out a bitter laugh. There's always a choice, Danny. You're just choosing you. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because Samuel was right. And the worst part? He still left anyway. Back to the present. Daniel sat on the rooftop of their old apartment, the city stretching out beneath him. It had been years since he had been up here, but it felt the same. The worn-out notebook lay beside him, pages yellowed with time. Samuel climbed up, sitting down next to him. You kept this old thing? Samuel asked, picking up the notebook. Daniel smirked. Of course. Samuel flipped through the pages, stopping at a familiar sketch, a rough drawing of a tall building with their last name on it. You really thought we'd build something like this? Samuel asked, amusement in his voice. Daniel exhaled. I did. Samuel studied the drawing for a moment, then set the notebook down. You know, Samuel said, voice quieter now, you leaving hurt like hell. Daniel swallowed hard. I know. Samuel leaned back, looking up at the sky. But maybe, if you hadn't left, we wouldn't be here now. Daniel turned to him. What do you mean? Samuel smiled slightly. I mean, if you had stayed, maybe we would have both just been struggling forever. But because you left, you learned what real success is. And now, we're actually building something together. Daniel stared at him, the weight of those words sinking in. So what you're saying is, you forgive me? Samuel smirked. I don't know. Jury's still out? Daniel chuckled. Fair enough. They sat in comfortable silence, two brothers who had lost each other once but had found their way back. And for the first time, Daniel knew, this time, he wasn't leaving.